The news from Rome struck Agrippina like a thunderbolt. Her beloved grandfather, Caesar Augustus, had died in the town of Nola. The official report, delivered to her husband Germanicus at his command post in Ara Ubiorum, carried even graver tidings. Agrippina's youngest brother, Posthumus Agrippa, and her mother, Julia, were also dead. Posthumus had been murdered under as yet unknown circumstances on the island of Planasia, and her mother, Julia, had been imprisoned in a single room in Rhegium until she starved to death. With the passing of Augustus, the Claudians had seized their moment, demonstrating the full weight of their ruthless ambition. At the head of her grandfather's state funeral had walked Tiberius, Livia, Castor, and Livilla, all Claudians. But Agrippina's sons, Nero and Drusus, blood descendants of Caesar Augustus, had been discreetly placed among the remainder of Augustus's extended family, a subtle yet calculated slight which revealed the Claudians' intentions. Tiberius was now Rome's imperator and pater patriae, his imperium maius and tribunicia potestas confirmed anew by the Senate. But Agrippina's husband was still the legal heir of Tiberius Caesar. In fact, had he not been so young at the time her grandfather had drawn up the succession a decade earlier, Germanicus would have been Augustus's first choice as heir. But, now that Tiberius had full control, would he honour her grandfather's wishes? Would he leave the principate to her husband Germanicus? Or would he instead favour his biological son Castor, thereby removing Agrippina's sons from the succession altogether? With the deaths of her grandfather, her brother and her mother, and the continued exile of her sister Julilla, the ascension of Tiberius cast even further uncertainty for Agrippina and for her children. However, having witnessed the removal of her family one by one, this uncertainty was not new for Agrippina. It was a way of life, a thing always to navigate. Tiberius's son, Castor, was in Rome, where he could easily play politics with those in the Senate who kowtowed to Tiberius. But Agrippina's husband, Tiberius's legal heir, held supreme command over the largest single military force in Rome's empire, 8 full legions given to him by Caesar Augustus himself. Clearly, Agrippina's grandfather meant for Germanicus to have military support with which to counter Tiberius, should he attempt to change Augustus's succession. And Agrippina had not squandered her grandfather's gift. When Agrippina and Germanicus last left Rome, their youngest son, Gaius, had been sick, forced to remain behind under the care of her grandfather's physicians. When little Gaius recovered, her grandfather sent him to her in Germania. With Agrippina's eldest sons, Drusus and Nero, kept in Rome to be formally educated, little Gaius became the last example of the lineage of Caesar Augustus, with whom to leverage continued support from the legions. Following the example set by her brother Gaius, who at the age of 12 had charmed Tiberius's legions in Germania, Agrippina fashioned a miniature soldier's outfit for her youngest son. This apparel came complete with a woolen tunic, cloth shirt, breast and backplates fastened together with straps, known as a cuirass, an iron helmet called a cassis, and the leather hobnailed sandals worn by the legions, called caligae. With the 2-year-old Gaius dressed in his Roman armour, Agrippina frequented the camps, showing her son off to the gushing legions, who made much of the adorable youth, nicknaming him Caligula, or Little Boots. Centurions and grizzled old soldiers alike would carry the toddler around, displaying him to their companies like a mascot, where they would play with the young soldier, entering into feigned combats and acting out tragic defeats to the delight of a giggling Caligula. By the time Agrippina's grandfather died, the legions at Ara Ubiorum were smitten with their mascot, and their support for the family of Germanicus and Agrippina seemed assured. However, news of Caesar Augustus's death changed everything. The mutiny began in Xanten. The units stationed under Germanicus's senior officer, Aulus Caecina Severus, were the first to become disgruntled. The Legios I Germanica, and 5 Alaudi, who had been stationed on the Rhine River since the Varian disaster 5 years earlier, were restless, and they were ripe for turmoil. A group of provocateurs within the centurion ranks, furious at the seemingly unending delay of reward promises made to them by Caesar Augustus, delivered incendiary speeches that agitated and excited the legions into a frenzy of discontent. Caesar Augustus had long ago established a military treasury to ensure bonuses and timely payments to Rome's legions. However, the practical implementation of these new reforms often fell short, leaving the soldiers aggrieved by the disparity between their actual conditions within Rome's military and the rewards they had been led to expect. Along with higher pay, the mutineers also wanted better retirement benefits. They sought the discharge bonuses promised to them by Caesar Augustus, which had never been doled out. They also sought land grants upon discharge, a traditional reward for Roman soldiers that dated back to the Republic, but was no longer reliably provided. Furthermore, the mutineers insisted on a reduction in the length of military service. They wanted their time in the legions to be reduced from the now standard 20 years, often extended by prolonged campaigns, to a maximum of 16 years for Rome's legionaries, and even shorter terms for her auxiliary forces. Before long, the discontent spread to Mogontiacum, infecting the Legios 14 Gemina and the 16 Gallica under the command of senior officer Gaius Silius. For the discontented legions of both camps, which erupted in violent rioting and bloodshed, the soldiers felt that the promises made to them by Caesar Augustus were now being outright ignored by the new regime under Tiberius Caesar. And so, pregnant once again, Agrippina left Ara Ubiorum with her husband Germanicus and her young soldier Gaius, and made her way to the military camp at Xanten, where her husband was determined to confront the growing crisis. Upon arriving in Xanten, Germanicus, whose victories in Pannonia and Germania had endeared him to the legions, ascended the military rostra. As the previously riotous assembly, now subdued and eager to hear, gathered around, Germanicus addressed their grievances. Standing before the restless soldiers, Agrippina's husband delivered a compelling speech promising to thoroughly investigate their complaints and offer concessions where feasible. His presence and assurances, delivered with the authority of a celebrated commander and member of the imperial family, restored some order and helped to placate the discontented troops, for the moment. Germanicus then sent urgent instructions to Rome, appointing his younger brother, Claudius, as his personal agent. He directed Claudius to swiftly liquidate several of Germanicus's properties and enlist the help of others to raise the necessary funds to address the unrest within the legions. Upon receiving the money, Germanicus took decisive action. Producing a dispatch bearing the signature of Tiberius Caesar, Germanicus distributed the long-overdue back pay and bonuses that had fueled the soldiers' discontent. Additionally, he granted honourable discharges to those who had served for 20 years or more, allowing them to retire and claim a portion of the rewards promised by Caesar Augustus. Although the dispatch from Tiberius mentioned that land grants for retired veterans would have to be addressed by the Senate, Germanicus's ability to deliver on other promises demonstrated to the legions at Xanten that he genuinely cared about their grievances. Gradually, the fervour of the mutiny began to subside. Agrippina and her son then followed Germanicus to Mogontiacum, where he continued to address the unrest by paying out additional overdue bonuses, retiring the most senior veterans, and restoring a sense of calm and discipline to the legions, all in the name of Tiberius. Finally, a delegation of senators arrived from Rome with a new letter from Tiberius. Read aloud from the rostra, the letter acknowledged the soldiers' discontent and lent some legitimacy to their demands. Tiberius promised to address their grievances and assured them that their overdue pay and bonuses would be rectified soon. However, Tiberius outright rejected the legion's demands for a reduction in military service and for land grants. Additionally, Tiberius called for greater discipline from the centurions and reminded the legions of their duty to Rome. When the legions at Mogontiacum heard this letter, so contradictory to the dispatch produced by Germanicus, the mutiny flared up anew. The senators barely escaped with their lives, and some of the legions even turned against Germanicus, accusing him of deception with the forged letter. Nevertheless, some within the mutiny saw the forged letter as leverage. Germanicus was already the heir to the principate, and Agrippina and Caligula, the descendants of the divine Caesar Augustus, were both present in the camp. It was soon whispered through the ranks that supporting the legitimate branch of Rome's imperial family could transform them from traitors and mutineers into heroes. Before long, the legions unanimously called for Agrippina's husband to march on Rome at the head of his 8 legions, cast Tiberius and his mother down, and proclaim himself imperator. Germanicus, however, refused, recognizing that acquiescing to the legion's notion would mean forever being controlled by them, if he was to be made imperator. Unwilling to be the puppet through which the mutinous legions might launch civil war, Agrippina's Claudian husband stood on the podium and loudly swore fealty to his adoptive father, Tiberius, and to Rome. Germanicus even went so far as to draw his gladius and point it straight at his own heart. Ready to plunge the gladius into the depths of his chest, Germanicus proclaimed, "If you persist in mutiny, if you abandon respect for authority, for the sacred duties you owe your country and your emperor, then here before you, by my own hand, will I end my life. You will then have the stain of a general's blood on your consciences and on your souls." But a legionary named Cassius, who supported leveraging Germanicus to their military ends, called his bluff. He drew his own gladius and held it up to the rostra. "If you are in earnest," Cassius taunted, "use mine, it's sharper." Germanicus then declared he would not die by the hand of a soldier, and stormed from the rostra. But Agrippina's husband made an immediate decision. That night, Germanicus, aware Agrippina's interests might align with those of the mutinous legions, decided to separate them. Without Agrippina and Caligula, the legions could no longer claim to be supporting a faction of the imperial family. Instead, they would have to end their mutiny at once, or be found in open revolt against Tiberius Caesar and against Rome. And so, the following morning, with her husband's legions as witnesses, Agrippina and her little soldier were loaded into gigs. The camp was steeped in a tense silence, the soldiers watching with bated breath as the descendants of the divine Caesar Augustus, surrounded by an armed escort, rode out of the camp, taking with them the mutinous soldiers' hopes and their plans, and leaving them filled with unresolved feelings of anger. For Agrippina, riding in a gig alongside her toddler, Gaius, and surrounded by a military escort, the reality was undeniable. The Claudians had orchestrated a coup against her grandfather, the late Caesar Augustus. As the countryside passed by, Agrippina's thoughts spiraled back to the calculated moves that had slowly dismantled her family's power over the years. The exile of her mother, Julia, the untimely deaths of her brothers Gaius and Lucius, the banishments of her sister Julilla and her last brother Postumus, all seemed meticulously planned. Through Livia Drusilla, the Claudians had enveloped Caesar Augustus in his final days, effectively cutting off the father of the nation from any dissenting voices. By monopolizing access to Agrippina's grandfather, Livia and Tiberius had secured their dominance over the imperial succession. In the wake of Augustus's death, Agrippina's exiled brother was swiftly executed, and her mother was locked in a room and left to starve. The Claudians' grip on power had tightened, leaving Agrippina and her children to navigate the dangerous waters of a shifting political landscape. But Agrippina's grandfather had given her a gift. He had named her husband, Germanicus Julius Caesar, as supreme commander of the 8 legions that guarded the Rhine. With the help of her little boots, Agrippina had managed to win over the legions, many of whom were old enough to remember the charms of her brother Gaius, who had donned his military gear at the tender age of 12. Immediately following the execution of posthumous Agrippa, 4 of her husband's 8 legions rose up in mutiny. While the official grievances centred on length of service and insufficient pay, the simmering discontent among the legions offered an opportunity, one that, if quietly nurtured, could refocus that anger toward those Agrippina saw as her enemies. Germanicus begged wealthy friends, and even sold his own properties, to gather the necessary funds to pay the legions. But, to maintain the illusion that the payout came from Tiberius, Agrippina's husband produced a forged letter for the soldiers. What a waste! All that wealth gone, wealth that could have been used to secure the loyalty of the troops, for himself. Unfortunately, the deception backfired when a delegation of senators arrived from Rome carrying promises and admonishments from Tiberius Caesar himself, statements that exposed the lies Germanicus had told. Publicly caught in forgery, Agrippina's husband became isolated from his legions and from Tiberius in Rome. With the air thick with discontent and the legions' frustrations bubbling over, it seemed almost inevitable that they would seize the opportunity to elevate Germanicus as their emperor in defiance of Tiberius. Whether by design or by a chance alignment of interests, Agrippina suddenly found herself in a position where the chaos around her played to her favour. But Germanicus was also aware of this alignment of interests. Refusing to march on Rome at the head of his legions and claim the curule chair by military force, Agrippina's husband reaffirmed his loyalty to the Claudians, and then sent both Agrippina and little Gaius to Gaul. The attack came swiftly. One moment, Agrippina was absorbed in her troubled thoughts, her hands folded across her abdomen as the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road echoed soothingly in the air. The next, the air was shattered by the cries of the mutinous soldiers. All of a sudden, a chaotic blur of movement descended on her gig, surrounding her military escort, who easily faltered under the surprise assault. The gig lurched violently to a halt, nearly throwing Agrippina and Gaius from their seats. Heart racing, Agrippina instinctively clutched her son Gaius, doing everything possible to shield him with her body, while simultaneously attempting to protect the unborn child housed within her womb. The soldiers who had been sent for their protection, unprepared for even the possibility of ambush within the Romanized territory of Gaul, were quickly overwhelmed by the mutineers, their disciplined ranks easily crumbling under the sheer ferocity of the attack. Agrippina barely had time to process what was happening before she felt rough hands seize her, dragging her and Gaius from the gig. Gaius screamed in terror, his small arms clamping desperately around Agrippina's neck as the two of them were torn from their only semblance of protection. The world spun around Agrippina as she was roughly forced onto unsteady feet. With no regard for her delicate condition or her frightened son's safety, her captors hauled her forward. Forced along by the gruff push of the mutineers, Agrippina realized she was now at the mercy of men who no longer answered to her husband. Instead, they adhered to the chaos that had taken hold of their hearts, chaos which Agrippina herself had foolishly encouraged. Suddenly, the safety of Germanicus's camp felt like a distant and long-forgotten memory, replaced by the cold, hard reality that her new captors, men who had recently sworn loyalty to her family, now saw Agrippina and Gaius as nothing more than tools to further their rebellion. Before her, the road ahead stretched endlessly, a path of dread. The sight that greeted Germanicus and his legions was one of pure horror. Agrippina and little Caligula, the granddaughter and great-grandson of Caesar Augustus, were barely recognizable. Dragged into camp as trophies, the mutineers still hoped to use them as leverage to overthrow Tiberius Caesar in favor of Germanicus. Dirt-streaked and exhausted, their clothes torn and their faces pale with fear, Agrippina and Caligula were mere ghosts of their former selves. For a moment, silence reigned. The legions, who had once cheered for the sight of Agrippina and her son, now faced the brutal reality of what the mutiny had wrought. The shock of it rippled through the ranks as they witnessed the depths to which some of their brothers had sunk. Then Agrippina fell to her knees. The violent attack, the stress, the pure terror, it had all been too much. Clutching tightly at her stomach, she was rushed to the safety of her private quarters. That night, Agrippina's cries echoed through the camp, giving a haunting voice to the whispers that rippled through the ranks. Agrippina had lost the baby. Terrified and shamed at their role in the death of a descendant of the god Augustus, the agitators of the mutiny dispersed, quickly hiding within the numbers of the rank and file. In that moment, a fire was ignited within those legions still loyal to Germanicus. The sight of Agrippina's suffering and the stark realization of what the mutineers had inflicted upon their beloved commander's family galvanized them. The call for vengeance became a rallying cry. The legions, their anger fused with a new sense of righteous fury, resolved to reclaim their honor and restore order. But Germanicus, having just lost a child due to the mutiny, imposed conditions. It had not been he who called for a march on Rome, a call to rise up against Tiberius Caesar. Thus, if the legions truly wished to regain his trust, Germanicus demanded that they end the mutiny themselves and punish the ringleaders as well. Only then would Germanicus consider them more than mere murderers of an unborn member of the imperial family, a crime Tiberius would have to punish. Over the next several days, as Agrippina recovered in her quarters, those who had instigated the mutiny were hunted down by those who wanted to return to the bosom of Rome and avoid the wrath of Tiberius, the father of Rome, to whom Germanicus's loyalty never faltered. As blood flowed in the dark, the legions' fingers pointed accusingly at one another. The yard gradually filled with the corpses of those deemed responsible for agitating the legions, and likely a few personal grudges as well, until finally the mutiny was over. But Agrippina had learned a harsh lesson. She had mistakenly assumed that the loyalty of the legions was a given, owed to her by virtue of her family's divine name and her own discreet manoeuvring. However, the brutal reality of the mutiny shattered that illusion. The legion's swift turn against her made it painfully clear. Loyalty was not a right, but it was something that could easily be lost. Germanicus had been right to refuse the mutineers' calls to make him emperor and prisoner. And so, to secure a future for her children, Caligula, recovering from his frightening ordeal, and Nero and Drusus both being educated in Rome, Agrippina needed to align herself directly with Germanicus. The subtle games and the covert machinations that once seemed promising now appeared futile. The immediate needs and volatile nature of the legions demanded a more straightforward approach. Working openly with her husband was Agrippina's best chance to ensure that one of their sons would one day become emperor and reclaim Rome from the Claudian usurpers. For Agrippina, every report from Rome seemed to carry nothing but bad news. First, she had learned of the deaths of her grandfather, Caesar Augustus, her mother Julia, and her only remaining brother, Posthumus Agrippa. The Senate had then conferred the title of imperator on her stepfather, Tiberius. And somehow, no one questioned the sequence of events surrounding her divine grandfather's death. After a journey to bid farewell to Tiberius, who was heading to Pannonia, Agrippina's grandfather fell ill and took to his bed at the family villa in Nola. Tiberius arrived a day or two later, and soon after that it was announced that her grandfather had died. But this announcement came only after the commander of the guard had murdered her brother, Posthumus Agrippa, on the island of Planasia. Now, nearly 2 years later, the news from Rome remained grim. Her cousins, Lucius and Marcus Scribonius Libo, had been forced to commit suicide, following their trials for conspiracy against Tiberius. Additionally, Agrippina's grandmother, Scribonia Libo, a woman well into her 80s, had also passed away, having lost her lifelong war against Livia Drusilla. How many of her relatives had to die before Tiberius was satisfied? And still, no inquiry into the murder of her brother had been opened by the Senate or by Tiberius. It was as if it never happened. Was it any wonder Agrippina preferred life with her husband's legions on the Rhine to the dangers of living in Rome, where Tiberius's spies could orchestrate a downfall similar to that of her mother and sister? Not that her life had been easy. Life with the legions was hard. After suffering a miscarriage during the mutiny's chaos, Agrippina soon found herself pregnant again. While her husband, Germanicus, marched into battle, conquered the Chatti, recovered one of Rome's lost eagles, and captured a high-value hostage, Agrippina stayed behind in the camp, ever the steadfast soldier's wife. "Take Caligula and go home," was the advice from her husband's soldiers and administrators. Each time Germanicus crossed the Rhine, there was the looming threat that the war could be brought right back to camp, endangering herself, her son, and her unborn child. But Agrippina, a descendant of the divine Caesar Augustus, reminded them of her lineage and resolutely declared that she would fulfill her duty, even in extremis, and remain by her husband's side. Soon after Germanicus returned to Ubiorum with the spoils of his successful campaign, Agrippina delivered her child. After giving birth to 5 boys, 2 of whom did not survive, Agrippina finally gave her husband a daughter. She was named Julia Agrippina, known as Agrippinilla. As her husband occupied himself with the building of ships and creating a strategy to defeat the armies of Arminius once and for all, Agrippina tended to her children and helped around the camp. Before long, she was carrying another child. Then, not long into the new year, more news arrived from her friends in Rome. It appeared that her murdered brother, Posthumus Agrippa, had come back to life. At first, the reports circulated like wild rumours, whispered in the Senate's corners or among the bustling markets. Some claimed Posthumus Agrippa had been seen on a remote island, hiding among sympathisers. Others swore they had glimpsed him in Rome itself, disguised as a commoner, and plotting his return to power. For Agrippina, this news reopened old wounds, sending shockwaves through her mind. Could it be true? Had her brother somehow survived Tiberius's treachery and escaped Planasia? Or was this merely a phantom conjured by the Senate's endless intrigue and her own grief? Each report brought a flood of questions and dangers. If true, Posthumus would be a direct threat to Tiberius's principate. Yet, even as a lie, the re-emergence of his name threatened to destabilize the Claudian hold on the empire. Either way, Agrippina knew that the news, whether of her brother's death or supposed survival, could bring unpredictable consequences for her and for her family. According to these reports, Agrippina's brother, who may have escaped Planasia by assuming a slave's identity, initially fled to Gaul. There he met secretly with supporters and spent the next year amassing a following substantial enough to challenge Italy. As news of his intentions to march on Rome spread, the people of the city grew increasingly excited. They hoped that a blood descendant of Caesar Augustus would finally reclaim his rightful place at the head of the empire. But subsequent reports revealed the grim outcome for Agrippina's brother. Tiberius, displeased with the public's enthusiasm for this prodigal son, dispatched the centurion Gaius Sallustius Crispus and his men under false pretenses, with promises of military support against Tiberius. Crispus, who had served Agrippina's grandfather and had announced posthumous Agrippa's murder to Tiberius and Livia at Nola, had been momentarily suspected of the murder himself, but the matter was never investigated. When Crispus and his men finally breached the inner circle surrounding Posthumus, they seized him by force and dragged him back to Rome. There, he was tortured on Tiberius's orders, who then personally interrogated him. The man was Vipsanius Clemens, a freedman of Posthumus who had served him during his exile on the island of Planasia. Clemens, possessing a similar build to Posthumus, had seized the opportunity to escape by donning his late patron's clothes. After growing his hair and beard to match those of an escaped prisoner, he made his way to Gaul, where he began building his support. When Tiberius confronted Clemens, he asked, "How is it that you came to be Posthumus Agrippa?" Clemens met Tiberius's gaze steadily and replied, "The same way you came to be Caesar." Although Vipsanius Clemens was executed by Crispus, many in Rome whispered that the story of an impostor was a lie. Some claimed that Gaius Sallustius Crispus had actually murdered Posthumus Agrippa, concealing the truth of his escape from Planasia behind a facade of lies. By autumn of the same year, Agrippina, heavily pregnant, moved to the military camp at Koblenz, where she anticipated the return of Germanicus and his legions. That spring, her husband had transported 50,000 men via ship into Germania's interior, with plans to finish off the armies of Arminius. But it was now mid-September, and there was still no sign of Germanicus's return. Word had reached her that a great battle had taken place along the Weser River, at a location known as Idistavisus. Germanicus had claimed the valley, while Arminius had positioned his forces in the surrounding forests, hoping to claim another victory modelled after his success in the Teutoburg forest. But Agrippina's husband had spent the winter studying that battle and was ready for Arminius. According to the reports, Germanicus placed his infantry in the centre and his cavalry on the flanks. There would be no surprise ambush this time. The fighting was reported to be brutal, and though he was not slain, Arminius was injured severely enough to flee the battlefield. The Roman legions, under the command of her husband, had won a great victory, finally breaking the allied armies of the Germanic tribes, whose survivors also fled. Germanicus then took the time to bury the Roman dead with the appropriate honours before beginning the journey back to Koblenz. So, where was he? Then, word arrived that a large number of Germanicus's fleet had been shipwrecked due to an unexpected storm. At this news, his staff at Koblenz began to fear. Scattered in various locations, forced to find their way back on foot, Germanicus's disorganized forces were now vulnerable to retaliation from the Germanic tribes who had fled. With no knowledge of the whereabouts of Germanicus and his men, the camp at Koblenz was suddenly in the gravest of danger. The tribes could instead attack them, simply by crossing the bridge that connected the camp to the opposite side of the Rhine. With Germanicus's return so delayed, the staff began making plans to destroy the bridge for the safety of the men within the camp. But to destroy the bridge was also to leave Agrippina's husband and all his men to die at the hands of vengeful tribesmen. Despite the pleas of Germanicus's staff, Agrippina announced that if they wished to destroy the bridge, they should do so with her on it. She then marched across the bridge and sat down on the other side of the Rhine to await the return of her husband. With the granddaughter of the divine Caesar Augustus stationed on the opposite side of the Rhine, the military architects hesitated to dismantle the bridge. Eventually, Germanicus and his men began to emerge from the forests, slowly making their way back to the safety of Koblenz. Upon seeing them, Agrippina quickly crossed the bridge to rejoin the camp, where she took up a position alongside the supplies. As the weary and exhausted soldiers arrived, Agrippina distributed blankets, food and drink, all while offering her heartfelt thanks for their service. Soon after being reunited with Germanicus, Agrippina again went into labour, where she delivered a second daughter, Julia Drusilla. With sons Drusus, Nero and Caligula, and daughters Agrippinilla and Drusilla, the dynasty of Germanicus, the future emperor of Rome, was secure. Then another dispatch arrived from Rome. But this one was not for Agrippina, it was for Germanicus. The dispatch was from Tiberius Caesar himself. Germanicus and his family were officially ordered to return to Rome.